I was really delighted when I approached Stephen to come and speak at the conference this year, because I had the good fortune a couple of years ago to travel to the United Kingdom and do a little bit of a study tour for a couple of weeks, looking at the impact of the austerity measures in the UK when there were significant changes to funding. And we'd come across, in our various meetings, we'd come across this particular program called the Troubled Families Program, and it seemed to have all of the things that we were really after or had talked about here in Australia for a long time. The funding for that program had come from a range of departments. It was not departmental, it had come from a range of sources, that the outcomes that were dedicated towards that program seemed to be shared across those, and that they were trying to find means by which to identify and work with the most disadvantaged families. And in fact, not only those that were showing up on their data Richter scale, but they were relying very heavily on charities to help them identify people who had fallen off what we know to be evident and were in fact people that were engaged with their services. So a very long-winded introduction as to why I had invited Stephen, but Stephen has been very much involved in evaluating the Troubled Families program. So he is currently a senior lecturer of social policy at Northumbria University, and his PhD thesis drew on interviews with practitioners to examine the implementation of this Troubled Families program in different local authority areas. Stephen has published extensively on the program, including journal articles, reports, and a book published by Policy Press called Troublemakers: The Construction of Troubled Families as a Social Problem. Prior to entering academia, Stephen worked with young people and community organisations in disadvantaged neighbourhoods in the northeast of England. His first book, In Their Place, The Imagined Geography of Poverty, was published by Pluto in 2017. So please join me in welcoming Stephen, who will be sharing with us on the topic Troubled Families or a Troubling Policy, Lessons to be Learnt from the Troubled Families program. Thank you. Let's join Stephen to the stage. Welcome.
Hello everyone. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the invite to speak here from Jackie and from colleagues at the FRSA. It's a real privilege to be invited to speak, and also kind of whenever anyone shows an interest in what you have to say, I always kind of feel very grateful for that. As a partner, a parent and a university lecturer, I'm used to complete indifference to what I have to say. So I kind of really do appreciate the invite to such a good conference and such an important occasion. I don't want to say too much about what I'm going to say. There's a short abstract in the booklet, so I won't duplicate that. But before I get started properly, I just want to mention a couple of things. A colleague of mine, an Australian colleague of mine, warned me against being the annoying POM who travels halfway around the world to tell Australian communities and practitioners what you should be doing. It's certainly not my intention to do that. Even before he gave me that piece of advice, that isn't what I'm going to be trying to do. I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about what has happened in the UK around this concept of troubled families and the kind of government policy that has followed from that term, and hope that you can make the connections with the Australian context, and certainly with what Michael was talking about, the review of family services in Australia. I hope that some of the things I talk about and some of the things that I mention have some resonance to what you're experiencing and kind of discussions that are ongoing here. The second thing I want to say is I'm going to try and talk for around about 45 minutes. I may overrun, but hopefully there will still be plenty of time for questions and discussion. If you don't get a chance to ask a question, or if you prefer not to speak in this arena, I know the feeling, then please come and kind of find me either afterwards or tomorrow or Friday. I'm around for the rest of the conference. I'd be really interested to speak to you, learn more about the Australian context, and I'll kind of gladly discuss any questions you have or try and fill in any gaps. Okay, so troubled families was a term or label or concept that emerged in the UK around about 2010. As I'm sure you're aware, as I'm sure it kind of is relevant in Australian history, there is a long history to similar labels, going back to, in the UK at least, to Victorian times and concerns about a social residuum. These labels have been successively reinvented every 10, 15, 20 years with a new name, slightly different features, but kind of an enduring idea that there is an underclass whose norms, cultural values, their aspirations and their behaviours are somehow different from the rest of us. The more recently kind of ideas around the culture of poverty, cycle of deprivation or transmitted deprivation or cycles of disadvantage, underclass and welfare dependency, I think, can be found in Australian discussions and rhetoric at the current time. I know you have an intergenerational inquiry, an inquiry into intergenerational welfare dependency going on at the moment. In the 1990s, we had the language of social exclusion, and in the 2000s, there was a kind of a return to concern about problem families. And as I say, troubled families emerged around about 2010. These labels have occurred and been reinvented. The reason the same label hasn't stuck is that generally evidence has shown that there isn't any kind of research has shown that there isn't any evidence to support the existence of such groups. Generally, a label emerges, research is carried out into it, largely disproves the existence of such a group. It dies away, and then another 5 or 10 years later, a new label emerges to take its place. And they've also, these labels have kind of been very consistent and robust, and they've emerged at different social and historical periods and at different times of economic development. In the UK, at the current time, the Troubled Families Programme emerged in 2010, the same time that a programme of austerity was implemented, which saw significant welfare reforms, increased conditionality within the welfare system, increased use of sanctions. And to quote one social policy academic, the welfare state was placed under the most severe and sustained attack it has ever faced in the UK. So, cuts to local services were more draconian and faster than in lots of other areas of government spending. It was almost precisely at this moment that the government saw that there was a re-emergence of concern with the family and government social policy. Practitioners were exhorted and urged to think family in their dealings and not see issues with individuals to be kind of issues that could be tackled with individuals, but to adopt a whole family approach. Our previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, argued in 2010 that the seeds of so many social problems as well as success stories are sown in the early years, and families are the building blocks of a strong and cohesive society. In 2014, he argued that whatever the social issue we want to grasp, the answer should always begin with the family. And in 2016, he argued that families are the best anti-poverty measure ever invented. He'd obviously never heard of money. They are a welfare, education and counselling system all wrapped up into one. And again, I see traces of this narrative in the summary report or the interim report of the intergenerational welfare dependency inquiry, where you have a kind of an aspect of that with parents being identified as the first teachers, kind of part of the first element of the education system. But of course, if you take this to its logical extension, if families are an anti-poverty measure, if they're a welfare, education and counselling system all wrapped up into one, then you legitimate and justify the withdrawal of the state and the removal of those services from their traditional realms. Why do you need a welfare state if your family can provide one? And certain families, no doubt David Cameron's family, could provide many of the things that he talks about here, but not all families are in a position to do that. In 2011, Mark Duggan, a black man, was shot dead by police in Tottenham, and following mishandling of that situation, as if it wasn't bad enough, following miscommunications between the police and his family, a peaceful vigil in Tottenham turned into the most violent riots in a generation in the UK. They erupted across London and other towns and cities in the UK for 5 or 6 nights. It was a time of real civil unrest where for a couple of nights police did not have controls of some of the major cities in the UK. It was kind of really interesting moment. Whilst the riots were ongoing, David Cameron argued that the riots were not about institutional racism within the Metropolitan Police. They were not about austerity or cuts or poverty. They were about criminality, pure and simple, people who didn't know the difference between right and wrong. Shortly after the riots had finished and before any announcement of any kind of formal inquiry had taken place, Cameron argued that it was kind of what we call broken families in the UK that were largely to blame. Argued that rioters probably didn't have a father at home, probably came from neighbourhoods where it's standard for children to have a mum and not a dad, and where it's normal for young men to grow up without a male role model, looking to the streets for their father figures filled up with rage and anger. He argued that if we want to have any hope of mending our broken society, family and parenting is where we've got to start. Again, bear in mind this was kind of 2 days after the riots had finished, before any analysis had taken place. That was in August 2011. In December 2011, Cameron launched the Troubled Families Programme. He said he wanted to be clear what he meant about troubled families. He'd used the phrase a couple of times in speeches previously, but he said he wanted to be clear this time. Officialdom might call them families with multiple disadvantages. Some in the press might call them neighbours from hell. In that, he cleverly conflates poor families, families living in poverty, with poorly behaved and antisocial families. He argued that whatever you call them, almost explicitly referencing the kind of the different labels of the underclass, we've known for years that a relatively small number of families are the source of a large proportion of the problems in society. Drug addiction, alcohol abuse, crime, a culture of disruption and irresponsibility that cascades through generations. We don't know this. What we know, in fact, is that this is untrue. Kind of over 100 years of social scientific evidence and inquiry in the UK has largely disproven what David Cameron's talking about here. But Cameron argued that there were 120,000 troubled families in the UK, in England, characterised by drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and various disparate other social problems. He claimed there was evidence around that. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But he was concerned that these families kind of transmitted these problematic behaviours onto their children, and the cycle continued. The government set out to turn around the lives of these 120,000 families by May 2015. Cameron made it his personal ambition to do that. May 2015 was the end of the coalition government's term of Parliament. They announced official criteria and allocated local authorities indicative numbers of troubled families in their areas that they were to work with. But in order to be classed as a troubled family, you had to have children or young people involved in youth crime or antisocial behaviour, children who were truanting regularly or permanently excluded from school, have an adult on out-of-work benefits, those were the three national criteria. If you met all three of those, you were automatically a troubled family. If you met two of the three and met a local discretionary criteria decided upon by each individual local authority, you could also meet the criteria. Some local authorities included things like domestic violence, children in need concerns. Some used living in a disadvantaged neighbourhood, which meant that in some local authorities, if you lived in one area of the kind of the city or the town in a disadvantaged neighbourhood, you would be classed as a troubled family. If you lived in a more affluent area but had exactly the same problems, potentially even more severe problems, you were not identified as a troubled family. And so it kind of entirely arbitrary, and what a troubled family was very different in different parts of the UK, in different parts of England. I keep saying the UK, it's a UK government programme, but it runs only in England. I should make that very clear in case anybody has Scottish or Northern Irish or Welsh relatives or kind of connections. Those governments that evolved administrations have not gone down the same route as the English programme that I'm describing here. There is a second phase of the programme, which again I'll come on to in a moment. The criteria changed ever so slightly, so we have the three headline national figures, and in place of the local filter criteria, we had a child in need, health or disability, and domestic violence. So the criteria for what constitutes a troubled family has shifted, but the label has remained the same. I think that's important to note. The government planned to do this through a model of family intervention, which is kind of a single caseworker taking a whole family approach and working allegedly intensively with the family. These are 5 family intervention factors identified by the government in a publication relating to evidence and good practice for the programme. It talks about a dedicated worker dedicated to a family. The picture, the image that you see is quite a famous one in Troubled Families work. Each different coloured post-it note represents an intervention in a family's life by a different agency. And it was this kind of allegedly uncoordinated approach with various missed opportunities that led to the idea that we need better coordinated services through a single caseworker working with the family. So as well as kind of gripping the family is some of the terminology that's used really problematic. A family intervention worker is supposed to grip and coordinate partner services as well. There's a strong emphasis on practical hands-on support, getting children out of bed, getting breakfast on the table, getting them ready for school, establishing bedtime routines, getting meals on the table, keeping the house clean and tidy. Very strong gender aspect within this. The focus is very much, although we have kind of the gender-neutral troubled families, what is generally meant within this is kind of a focus on allegedly troubled mothers. Working-class women disproportionately bear the burden of the focus of this programme. It's supposed to be a persistent and challenging and assertive approach, that as well as the supportive element, there is this aspect where practitioners are not afraid to challenge the families when necessary and are prepared to tell it like it is. And again, the kind of whole family approach, gathering all the intelligence and this kind of idea of a common purpose and agreed action plan. Just a couple more sound bites or phrases that have been used to describe the approach. One is one worker, one family, one plan. Looking at the family from the inside out, and someone described it as starting with the family and working backwards. And again, my concern with this rhetoric, although it's at a very surface level, it's hard to disagree with much of it, the intense focus on the family deflects attention away from wider structural issues and kind of leaves problems that originate outside the home, labour market conditions, levels of poverty, housing supply, etc., largely undiscussed and irrelevant to the family intervention approach. The muscular, assertive element of it can slip into phrases like this, where Louise Casey, who was the Director General in charge of the first phase of the troubled family, talks about this kind of being the approach that it takes. It kind of gets into the actual family, gets the kids ready for school, and then says to the parents, I'm going to show you how to do it, and then I'm going to make you do it. And if you don't do it, there are going to be consequences. I'm not sure that any disadvantaged family needs this kind of help or support, but this is how it's been phrased and kind of discussed by the government. Is anybody familiar with Louise Casey? Anybody come across her before? No? Okay, so in the UK, she's very high profile. Civil servants generally tend to fly beneath the radar and don't kind of make too many public statements. Louise Casey is very different to that. If I'm trying to find an appropriate cultural comparison for Louise Casey, I would argue she's the David Warner of the UK civil service sector. Her performances and her results are very impressive on paper, but when you scrutinise the methods by which they are achieved, they don't come out of it particularly well, I would argue. Okay, I'm glad you got that. I'm glad that's culturally relevant. Okay. And the programme is funded on a payment by results model. So local authorities receive funding when they began working with the troubled family, when they attached themselves to that family, and then they receive further funding, the levels of which changed over the course of the programme, when certain results were achieved. When a child was back in school over 85% of the time, or when crime and antisocial behaviour had reduced, or when an adult had moved off out of work benefits. There was no opportunity to claim twice for two different results. You got one or the other. This is very, very problematic. Go into more detail in a moment, but if an adult moves off out of work benefits, that was kind of claimed by practitioners to be the golden ticket. That was the most money you could get. No matter what else was happening in the household or within the family, it didn't matter. The government paid up, and that family was classed as having their lives turned around. Not surprisingly, given that the Prime Minister stated it was his ambition to turn around the lives of the families by the end of the Parliament, the government claimed that they had achieved 99% success in doing that. It was the perfect social policy, I wrote at the time. A senior police officer told me that as soon as Cameron stated that he wanted to do this, the programme was doomed to succeed, which I thought was a kind of a really good turn of phrase. In many local authorities, in 130 out of 102 different local authority areas, their performance was literally perfect. In progress statistics released and published by the government, In 130 of these local authorities, they had identified, worked with and turned around precisely the number of troubled families that they had been allocated by the government. They had not failed with any, there was no attrition, no families had failed to engage, they hadn't had to work with more families in order to get the success. According to published reports and published statistics, they were perfect in what they had done. And bear in mind, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, this was at a time when the welfare state in the UK was under its most sustained and severe attack it's ever faced. It was at a time when increasing numbers of children were being taken into care, at a time when homelessness levels were increasing, when the amount of children in temporary accommodation was increasing, and when child poverty figures were rising. Despite this, the government claimed that it had successfully turned around the lives of the most troublesome families in England. So if I stopped there, everything would be great. What's not to love? And I would be the annoying Pom coming over and saying, this is what you need to do. Perfect success. Unfortunately, it's not quite as crystal clear as that. And the official evaluation of the programme, a large-scale, multi-partner, multi-stream evaluation, found no evidence at all that the programme had had any impact on any of the outcomes it attempted to find. So the evaluation included interviews with local authority staff and managers. It included interviews with families, a survey with families, included family monitoring data which gathered the characteristics of families on entry into the programme, and it included an impact case study which matched the performance of families on the programme with families with very similar characteristics who were waiting to to enter into the programme. The report was delayed for a year. It was suppressed because it was kind of unflattering and kind of completely contradictory to the government rhetoric. But it found, as well as this quote, which is taken from the impact report, a couple of other things. The evaluation report went on to say, our analysis found no impact on these outcomes attributable to the programme. And it goes on to say, there were no positive or negative impacts identified for housing, employment and job seeking, antisocial behaviour and crime, school behaviour and attendance, health, drug or alcohol use, family dynamics or well-being. And that held true across different elements of the evaluation, both short-term outcomes and longer-term administrative data. A government committee called the Public Accounts Committee scrutinised the programme because of concerns about the claims that were being made and the non-publication at the time of the evaluation. And the Public Accounts Committee, this is a parliamentary committee, found that the delay in publishing the evaluation was unacceptable. The department was evasive and obfuscatory, which furthered the impression that the government was reluctant to be open and transparent about the Troubled Families Programme. The terminology used by the department overstated the success of the Troubled Families Programme in transforming the lives of families, it said. So it's now in its second phase. This is Joe Took, who's replaced Louise Casey as a director. There are now 400,000 more troubled families identified using the new criteria that I mentioned. Quite how they escaped the initial identification, I don't know. But there's new criteria for identifying these families. There's been a shift in the rhetoric from turning around the families' lives to them making significant and sustained progress. There's new payment by results criteria where, again, the families have to demonstrate progress according to indicators and measures and practitioner perspectives. But again, moving off out of work benefits into employment trumps all the other ones. If you get that, you are paid, the local authorities paid by the government. There's a renewed focus on tackling worklessness that was announced earlier this year. And there's been increasing emphasis on service transformation, as there has been increasingly damning evidence that the programme has not impacted on families' lives. The government have shifted their focus to talking about the impact it's had on services and the transformation of services at a time of austerity. It operates at a much lower profile in the UK at the current time, primarily because I think Louise Casey has gone and she was very high profile, Joe Took isn't. There was no new funding announced for it in the recent budget. And it's no longer kind of the flagship social policy of the government as it was in between 2010 and 2015. Universal credit, the flagship welfare reform, which I'm not sure if you know about, is very high profile in the UK. It's causing a lot of misery in the UK, a lot of hardship, and that is very much in the news at the moment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what we've decided to do in terms of our relationship with the EU, but the issue of Brexit has blown everything out of the domestic policy agenda. You know, kind of what we genuinely can't think of anything else in the UK at the current time other than Brexit, or kind of our policy makers can't, at least. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I found in my interviews and my research. It's from street-level bureaucrats, street-level practitioners. Many of you will hopefully recognise some of the things we're going to talk about. Despite the portrayal of the Troubled Families Programme as being this distinctive, new and innovative approach, lots of the people working on the programme dismissed that and thought it wasn't really that much different from what they'd been doing or what they'd been urged to do over a longer period of time. It certainly wasn't seen as a more streamlined or more efficient programme, and the payment by results model created lots and lots of bureaucracy, lots of form filling, lots of administrative tasks where they had to account for how they'd spent their time and justify the work that they had done. And then certainly the political pressure on them kind of increased the record keeping amongst frontline staff. Despite the rhetoric that it's one worker, one family, one plan, the people I spoke to could not emphasise enough their reliance on colleagues and other services that were being cut to the bone by austerity measures, and those people with specialist skills and long-term experience in different areas. There was lots of kind of small-scale subversion and resistance, what I call legitimated transgressions, bending the rules of the game, bending the rules of the programme without actually breaking it or openly and explicitly rejecting it. Somebody spoke of playing two different games within the Troubled Families Programme. You play the local game with your partners and with the families. You do the work that you know is important, and you get that done. And then you play the national government game where you give them the figures that they need to keep the money coming in and keep them off your back, which I thought was kind of a very good way of looking at it. And lots of the practitioners that I spoke to were aware of structural issues and the impact that they have on these families' lives. Some practitioners argue that it's poverty ultimately, isn't it? What we're doing is trying to mop up the effects and the consequences of people living in poverty. A local authority perspective, again, just before I move on. This is a picture that was in the Times newspaper in the UK a couple of weeks ago. It's a queue forming outside a community centre at lunchtime in Oldham, a borough in the northwest of England, just outside Manchester. And it's a queue for free food. People relying on food donations and food parcels. Again, I don't know if you're aware, there was a UN special rapporteur visited the UK to examine the extreme poverty that can be found in the UK at the moment as a result of the government's welfare reforms. Anyone familiar with this or heard about it? Has it made the news? Yeah. There's a guy called Philip Alston, who by coincidence is an Australian legal academic. He's a professor of law at a university in New York, special rapporteur for the UN, and there have been concerns raised about levels of poverty in the UK as a result of welfare reform. So he spent a week gathering information on the context in the UK. As a link to that, the Times did a week-long investigation into poverty, and this is, I just want to read tell you a little bit about this. So this is in Oldham. It tells the story of a woman called Mariella who was evicted from her home with her 2 young children, a toddler and a newborn baby, after they fell behind on rent because of problems with the universal credit, this new welfare payment system in the UK. And they ended up in a hostel. And Mariella was reduced to eating leftovers out of the bin at the work canteen, she said. And her family relied on food parcels from a charity that was supermarket surplus that was destined for landfill. It's kind of food that was going out of date or had just gone past its sell-by date. And that was how Mariella was getting by. And this is not an unusual instance or occurrence in the UK. Less than a week later, on the Troubled Families blog, the government and somebody from Oldham Borough Council published a blog highlighting the Oldham model and how the Troubled Families Programme was enabling them to deliver more effectively on their ambitions to develop more sustainable approaches, and argued that it had been a catalyst for wider service transformation across a range of public services. And there was a lot of sound bites that we hear from politicians and senior people about building thriving communities, integrating services, adopting an inclusive approach, and a whole population, whole system, place-based approach to early intervention and prevention. If you looked at this lovely, bright model, the Oldham model, you would think that it's almost some kind of utopia was existing in Oldham. And it's this kind of, what jars with me is the difference between the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, and the service transformation rhetoric, and the reality that families like Mariella and others, many others, are experiencing in Oldham. And again, one of the things I think is very interesting is the lack of leadership, lack of challenge to the programme from organisations who I would have hoped would have been more vocal in their criticism. I often think that in the UK, I'm sure in Australia, we look at what's happening in the US with aghast and think, oh, that could never happen here. But increasingly, I come to think of what the government has been doing around the Troubled Families as being propagating alternative facts. You know, one week we have an investigation into Oldham highlighting the destitution that families there face. The next week we have the Oldham model highlighting how the Troubled Families Programme is transforming services and is kind of developing this inclusive economy and building thriving communities. They don't match up. They really don't match up. Okay, so that's a very quick-fire summary of the programme. Started in 2010, is now in its second phase and is scheduled to go through until at least 2020. I just want to focus on 4 specific aspects of the programme that might be relevant to some of your thinking, some of your work as well. The extent to which the families on the programme actually constitute neighbours from hell, I think is very interesting. Remember, Cameron argued that they were neighbours from hell. They were also called teenagers rampaging around the estates. They were filled up with rage and anger. Louise Casey referred to them as the worst families who you wouldn't want to live beside. And if you look at some of the characteristics or some of the behaviours of the families that went through the first phase of the programme, I'd argue you see quite a different figure. So only 14% of these allegedly most troublesome, most criminal, most antisocial behavioural families in England, only 14% had an adult with a proven offence in the previous 6 months. Only 41% had a police call out to their household for any reason whatsoever in the previous 6 months. I'm not joking, I know a law professor who has more call-outs for antisocial behaviour in the last 6 months than this genuinely. So, you know, kind of these very, very low levels. Only 10% of children from these, the most disadvantaged, most troublesome families allegedly were permanently excluded from school. 90% of children were in school, albeit not necessarily regularly, but at least they were in school. 5% of adults in these families were dependent on alcohol. 6% of these adults were dependent on non-prescription drugs. These are significant numbers, but they are not the numbers that signify an underclass with kind of huge problems different to the rest of us. All of those problems can be found across the income spectrum as well. In contrast, 83% of adults in these families were receiving out-of-work benefits. We need to be very clear that this does not mean that they were workless, that they were work-shy, that they were welfare dependent. A minority in both the first phase and the second phase of adults were seeking employment. Out-of-work benefits in the UK covers a whole range of benefits. The vast majority of people on the programme and more widely on out-of-work benefits are not expected to be seeking work, not expected to be undertaking employment because of caring responsibilities of either very young children or relatives with health and disability issues, or because of their own disability and health issues. So by way of example, just over 1/3 of adults on the Troubled Families Programme were claiming job seekers allowance. The other 2/3 were not expected to be seeking work. And of course, there were lots of families that were in work. In second phase, it's only 18% of adults claiming job seekers allowance. The other 82% are either in work or not expected to be working. 29% are in rent arrears. This was at the end of the first phase, the evaluation guarantee. Now, Troubled Families on the programme, it will be an even higher percentage of that. Parenting difficulties identified as an issue in the family, 67%. Why isn't that 100%? Every family I know experiences parenting difficulties at some point. And they come to my house, you will see a parent who's experiencing difficulty with their children. There is no guidance, there is no definition as to what constitutes parenting difficulties. It's left entirely up to the discretion, the subjective opinion of the practitioner. Incredibly problematic. I've also seen this statistic added to and conflated with child abuse and neglect to inflate the figure. And Joe Took presented at a national conference where he gave a number where it was parenting difficulties and child abuse or neglect, and it was in the 70% region. Again, that conflation is incredibly dangerous, I think, but it serves a purpose. Mental health problems, disability, long-standing illness, children with long-standing illness and disability, higher levels that you see when compared with levels of criminality or antisocial behaviour or school exclusion. So the misrepresentation of troubled families, of kind of families experiencing troubles as troublesome families is really problematic. But again, there is a long history to these ideas. A quote I often use shows that this is a recurring problem. I said at the start of the presentation that Cameron very cleverly conflated families experiencing multiple disadvantages with neighbours from hell. And Golding and Middleton, in a review of welfare, going back to the 16th century, argued that ever since we chopped off the ears of beggars, we've had some difficulty in distinguishing poverty from crime in the UK. The next thing I want to kind of take issue with is this idea of a family intervention model. Louise Casey argues that we know it works because we've looked at studies that show that it works, and she's also met countless families that have been turned around. Again, it's been kind of portrayed as a pioneering, innovative approach, which it's not. Anyone familiar with the history of social work will know that the first example of casework came from the Charitable Organisation Society in the 1880s in London. They argued that wily paupers were playing the system and receiving support and arms from a wide range of uncoordinated services, and what you really needed was a single caseworker to work with that family and ensure that they only got the support that they needed. There are countless other historical and international examples, including in Australia, I understand. I read a journal article recently about a program called Families New South Wales and Brighter Futures in New South Wales, where the rhetoric is very, very similar. You get a single caseworker adopting a whole family approach and attempting to coordinate services and support the family more effectively. But there are problems with it. There's been a significant shift in the UK in what family intervention actually is. When it started, it was a single charitable project in Dundee, in Scotland, and it was called, and the model was intensive family support. When it crossed the border into England, it became family intervention. So the shift, the rhetorical shift from support to intervention is very important, I think. The supportive element, again, when it came into England, became accompanied by the threat of sanctions in what became known as a twin-track model. So you had this kind of support, but if the families didn't engage with and to some extent comply with what was expected of them, you had the threat of sanctions to accompany that and back it up. And in the original family intervention model, there was a core residential block, kind of very intensive supervision and surveillance of families, managed tenancies, and outreach work. The outreach work was the least intensive element of the family intervention model, which saw family workers working with around about 5 or 6 families each. The family intervention model under the Troubled Families Programme, the most intensive model is a worker working with 5 or 6 families, and the least intensive model, what Louise Casey refers to as family intervention super light, sees caseworkers holding caseloads of around about 25 to 30 families. And that's not intensive work at all. And it's a very significant shift from what the original model was. There's been a misrepresentation of the evidence, surprise, surprise. I won't go into detail, but the headline figures that are used to demonstrate the success of family intervention models over a long period of time in the UK are not supported when you look at the actual reports. There's been maybe 10 or 15 evaluations of family intervention projects of different ilks and different times carried out over the last 20 years in England and Scotland. Headline figures are really impressive. When you look at the reports, as I've done in great detail, the evidence is much more ambiguous and ambivalent. There is some positive aspects and some areas where kind of very little impact can be found. There have been no long-term studies done, despite researchers involved with the evaluations arguing in various different reports that that is what is required. No government has ever funded longitudinal studies to understand the long-term impact of family intervention model. We hope that the current evaluation of the second phase might address that, but then again it might not. Family intervention has been used to address a wide range of problems and issues. If you think about the 6 criteria for the second phase, under New Labour, the family intervention model was used to address child poverty, youth crime, various health issues, and there's no evidence at all that it addresses such a wide array of issues. How can it address worklessness when jobs aren't there, which is the main problem in the UK at the moment? And of course, it doesn't attempt to address structural issues. The focus, as I've said, has very much been on the family, behavioural issues that allegedly originate within the family, and kind of marginalises wider things that take place outside the family. I think it's telling and significant that no family intervention programme has ever had the alleviation of poverty as an intended outcome. The explicit improvement in families' material circumstances has never been a primary consideration. Okay, so some people have argued that at every stage of the total family's development and design and implementation there have been errors made. I would agree with that, but I also think that at every stage the programme has relied on duplicity and deceit. The original 120,000 figure came from research carried out in 2004-05 that looked at families that experienced 5 out of 7 disadvantages. Those disadvantages were related to low income, poverty, material deprivation, inadequate housing, maternal mental health, lack of skills, and people on out-of-work benefits. The government used that research, despite the researcher who had carried it out telling them it was not appropriate to do so, used that research to demonstrate or prove the existence of 120,000 families characterised by crime and antisocial behaviour. Despite very explicit, wide-ranging criticism of that decision, the government have stood by that decision and stood by their portrayal of that research throughout, arguing that it was the best guess that they had, the best kind of figure that they had. The 99% success, I think, as kind of shown, is incredibly duplicitous. One commentator argued that North Korea wouldn't attempt to suggest a 99% success rate for their social policy. Research carried out with families, which was criticised for being incredibly stigmatising and pathologising them and focusing almost exclusively on the negative aspects of their lives, was queried. It turned out that there was no ethical procedures that predated that research. In response to a freedom of information request from an academic, the government replied that they didn't need ethical approval for the discussions with families because it was dipstick policy-related conversations and wasn't classed as research. The academic's response, which I agree with, is that if you're gathering information from human subjects, vulnerable kind of groups, and you're talking about very, very emotive and sensitive issues, you need to make sure you're doing it ethically. That wasn't, it was Louise Casey that carried out the research and didn't get ethical clearance for it. Louise Casey made up a statistic that she argued made the case for radical reform. This is an issue that's close to my heart because she gave numerous presentations at conferences, but I think in 2014 she gave 2 speeches at conferences to council leaders and directors of children's services and local authorities where she argued that in a disadvantaged neighbourhood in the northeast, close to where I grew up, there were 3,000 children who weren't registered with a dentist and had never been to a dentist's appointment. Of those 3,000, she said that 300 had turned up at accident and emergency for emergency dental treatment. And she argued that this one statistic encapsulated the problem and demonstrated the need for radical reform. I issued a freedom of information request, which eventually revealed that there was no such survey and no such statistic. It was an anecdote that had been shared in a meeting a year previously, and Casey hadn't thought to check the veracity of that statistic, but used it in high-profile settings to demonstrate that this was needed. I also think that there is great damage that can be done when the hygiene of disadvantaged communities and the hygiene of children and health is called into question. I think that is a particularly pernicious way to discuss the problems that some families face. Casey argued that these were the worst families just at the time that an interim report was published which showed that they were not involved in the same levels of antisocial behaviour as the rhetoric suggested. The cost to the imaginary taxpayer has been inflated. At the start of the programme, the government argued that on average troubled families cost the taxpayer £75,000 each. Subsequent research on the programme suggested that the level was much closer to £25,000. So the cost to wider society has been exaggerated as well. And when researchers who were involved in the evaluation kind of questioned the programme and expressed misgivings about some of the rhetoric surrounding the programme, Casey's response was to question the ability and the integrity of the researchers involved with the programme and kind of suggested that they were doing it for personal gain. The payment by results model, I think, is something which is being discussed. Outcomes-based accounting, outcomes-based commissioning, kind of performance frameworks are something that's relevant at the moment. Payment by results are particularly problematic. I think the Troubled Families Programme is a particularly problematic demonstration of that. I'll try and quickly go through some of these issues. So, troubled families could be claimed for as a success without the local authority having done any work with them. They trawl through data of families that at one point met the criteria for being a troubled family, and if that family had managed to turn themselves around, largely by an adult finding work, as people do all of the time, of their own volition, the local authority could claim that that family had been turned around, could claim it as a success. Children reaching school leaving age could trigger a successful claim. In many cases across the country, when a child reached the age of 16 and left school, in certain circumstances, that could be claimed as the government, as the programme turning around the life of the family, local authority being paid and the government claiming it's a success story. Kind of nothing else might have changed, but certain circumstances allow that to happen. And that did happen. Again, I issued a freedom of information request in some local authorities. Hundreds of families were turned around in this way. Problems could commence in a family or increase in frequency or severity if an adult moved off out of work benefits. Remember, that's the golden ticket according to practitioners. That's the ka-ching moment, they called it. And if an adult moved off out of work benefits, anything else going on in that household could continue, it could increase, more problems could emerge. According to the payment by results model, according to political rhetoric, that family's life had been turned around. The quality of work, as we know in the UK, I think, again, in Australia, the kind of issues around the quality of work, the insecurity, the precarity of it, existence of other troubles that aren't, such as domestic violence in the first phase of the programme, and change in the material circumstances of families are not recognised. They're of secondary importance to the payment by results model. And there's a big difference, practitioners recognise, between making a claim from the government, getting money in, and actually closing a case, actually stopping working with a family. In some authorities, supervisors talked of practitioner integrity, where, kind of according to the government, this family's life had been turned around, but a practitioner was unwilling to start the kind of the closure process and wanted to continue working with families. In other authorities, claim and closure were very much the same thing. As soon as a claim was made and as soon as the money was in, practitioners were told to move on, get on to the next family and keep the money coming in. Again, which is not the kind of service I'm sure that we want to be designing and delivering. If, as the Assistant Minister said this morning, you want to examine the evidence, you particularly want to examine the evidence around payment by results, you wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, basically. There's a long history of over 100 years of payment by results methodology. It's not as new as we think it is. In the same way that there's no evidence to support the idea of an underclass, there's no evidence really to support the idea that payment by results works really effectively. First quote is from the National Audit Office, an investigation into payment by results methods in the UK. This is from a review undertaken by for the Australian and New Zealand School of Government in 2016. I'll give you more details on that if anybody's interested. But they argued that the evidence suggests that the rhetoric of outcomes-based contracting does not always reflect its reality. And a further review carried out just recently, published a couple of months ago, argued that lots of unintended consequences, mainly around gaming, information manipulation, selective attention, etc. Lots of evidence about creaming and parking through payment by results, the idea that people and service providers choose the low-hanging fruit and leave the more problematic clients, some of the more difficult and challenging clients, to later on, or in the UK in a different program, leave them to subcontractors to do. Okay, so I hope I've kind of highlighted a pretty critical perspective on some of the things that we've done in the UK. I'm often asked what I would do differently or what should be done differently, and I often return to this quote by Barbara Wootton from the 1950s. Barbara Wootton was one of the first ladies to sit in the House of Lords in the UK, and whilst language might have moved on a bit, I kind of genuinely agree with this. I don't think we can abolish some of the things that affect human nature. But I do think that the things that we've talked about in Social Families Programme can be found across the income spectrum, but they are more problematic and certainly deemed to be more problematic by the government in disadvantaged and poor families. And often families having the material resources that some of us enjoy means that they're able to deal with and cope with these problems a lot more easily than if they don't have the resources. In terms of alternatives, nothing I'm going to say here, I guess, will be particularly innovative or transformational for you. I think there should be universal services. I don't see the need to label or name services. We should just get on with it, kind of acknowledge that many families require support at different stages of their lives without kind of needing to put a specific label on it. It should be couched in the rhetoric of support and help, not intervention. It needs to be properly resourced, which not by outcomes-based accounting or payment by results methods. It needs to be based within a just welfare system. You can't kind of talk about change to families' lives if they don't have the resources to afford them an adequate standard of living. And it needs to be based on a commitment to long-term outcomes and a good evidence base. Use the existing evidence base, but also build a new evidence base. And funnily enough, it's not so long ago that we had this in the UK. We had Sure Start, neighbourhood-based Sure Start centres, universal provision for preschool children and their families. We had a legally binding commitment to eradicate child poverty by 2020, and we had good progress against child poverty rates. Unfortunately, for various reasons, things have changed, and what we had 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, is now being dismantled, and we're in a very different position. But all that's required is for different politicians to come in, different political perspectives, and those things can be rebuilt again. I'll end. Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur, one of the things he said that really struck a chord, is kind of a very damning report. He said that if you stuck a bunch of misogynists in a room and asked them to come up with the most damaging welfare reforms you could imagine to women, he said that they would have come up with something not entirely dissimilar to the welfare reforms that we're pursuing in the UK at the current time. Kind of really, really strong language he used. And I'd argue the same can be said of the Total Families Programme. If you stuck a bunch of misogynists in a room and tasked them with coming up with a programme that was detrimental and disadvantageous to working class women, it wouldn't be too far from what we've got in the UK at the current time. It doesn't have to be like this. This is a quote that I saw in a different context a couple of years ago, and it stuck with me, and it's it resonates to this day. I understand you don't have hedgehogs in Australia, so kind of despite the amazing wildlife you have, you're missing out without having hedgehogs. These are the final two lines from a poem by Philip Larkin. The poem is called The Mower. I won't tell you what happens to the hedgehog in the poem because it's not good, but he argues that we should be careful of each other and we should be kind while there is still time. And if we're looking for a change in what we do, I think this is a pretty good change that we can all be and that we can all subscribe to. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm sure that you would agree with me that we made a very good choice in bringing Stephen all the way from the UK to be able to share the experience of the Troubled Families program. We do have probably about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. Do we have some questions from the floor? Have we got it? We have 2 mics set up in the middle of the room. Yes? So we have, if people could just come up to the mics. One little thing I really didn't, in briefing you, Stephen, one thing I didn't ask you to outline in particular was you referred a lot to local authorities, and I think one of the big differences here is we have a Commonwealth government, federal, we have state, we have local government, so we have various ranges. Can you just briefly outline to us a little bit of how that system works in the UK, please?
Sorry.
No.
So in the UK, to cut a long and complex story short, we have national government, some devolved administrations, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, but they're not applicable to the policy. But basically, we have national government that established the Troubled Families programme and provided the funding for it, and it was to be delivered by local authorities, which are generally cities, small towns, collection of villages, kind of rural areas. So, for example, Cairns would be one local authority in the UK, and it was them that received the funding and decided how they allocated the funding, they spent the funding, and they, in a number of cases, they drew on partners from charitable organisations, third sector bodies and what have you to do that. But it's a national government programme that was delivered by the smaller local government areas and bodies. Is that?
Thank you. Thank
That
you.
makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, we do. We have a question here. Stephen, don't run away.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
As I was listening to you, it jumped into my head because it was a bit depressing. A podcast I was listening to about the concept of a universal wage, and I wondered if you had any comments that you could make, any thoughts about that concept.
Yeah, okay. I fully support that, the idea of a universal basic income, people often call a citizen's income, where everyone receives an amount of money that enables them to achieve an adequate standard of living regardless of their engagement in the labour market or the type of work that they do. I think that has to be the way forward. I think financially it obviously enables kind of the resolution of poverty, hopefully ensures that families have an adequate income to support their needs, make decisions about how they live their lives. But also symbolically, I think it's incredibly important where in theory, we're equal before the eyes of the law, but governments and society value us differently based on the money that they allocate, and I think that's incredibly problematic. I think identifying everybody as being worthy and equal in terms of the income that they receive from the state is an incredibly symbolic step to kind of get rid of ideas like the underclass, if you like, and seeing poor people as somehow different from the rest of us. So yeah, I think universal basic income is something that should be explored. That would be a truly innovative and transformational approach, I think, yeah.
Nettie Horton from Catholic Care in Melbourne. I actually arrived in Australia in the late 80s, so I sort of went through some of those phases that you highlighted. But it's been really interesting to me that the whole time I've been here, I've been quite fascinated about the Australian obsession to look to the UK or the States to somehow, because somehow it's going to be better, and every time I go home, I don't actually see a lot that excites me. But what I really want to ask you, do you have, given that Australia does look to the UK and others, and I'm assuming there are people from the federal government in the room, so hopefully they've heard what you have to say. Do you have any notes of optimism that, and what are your thoughts on, if you are optimistic about where policy might go to? Because I think we have to run with the fact that our policy makers and decision makers so often will do the overseas tour and think that what they've seen is fabulous, and when they see those results that you've highlighted to us today, you can actually forgive people for thinking that is the way to go. Thank you.
Yeah, really good point. And we look to the States, you know, for our welfare. We've got far better examples closer to home in the UK. Why we don't jump across the North Sea and go to visit the Scandinavian countries where far more equal, far more successful in many ways than the UK, or even to France or other parts of mainland Europe. I have no idea with the American obsession that we have. There are notes for optimism, of course. So like I said, it wasn't that long ago when things were looking better in the UK. And I don't want to make it a kind of political discussion, but we had a party that invested in universal services and kind of spent money that was in favour of government spending. And as a result of the financial crisis and the change of government, we had a government that was elected on and kind of absolutely committed to austerity and rolling back the state. And again, but if you look at how different countries responded to the economic crisis, there were a range of different responses. The UK is a particularly severe response. But like I said, so one reason for optimism is it wasn't that long ago when things were that much better. We shouldn't forget that. Also, and perhaps I didn't say enough about this, that the practitioners give me cause for optimism. A lot of them that I spoke to knew this was not great, and they attempted to soften some of the blows of the policy and the rhetoric when they were dealing with families. I think it's such a problematic policy that it's difficult to do that, difficult to fully soften the blows, but there is kind of some very critical perspectives from practitioners, and this idea of playing two games, that you play the game that the national government wants you to play, you dance to their tune whilst you're in the room with them, and when they go, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief and you go back to doing the work that people know is valued and important, and the work that families respond to. I think gives me cause for optimism as well, hopefully.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking Stephen.